Imagine you are sitting in your living room right now. It is 8 p.m. on a Tuesday. The room is softly illuminated by the glow of a massive 65-inch flat-screen television mounted to the wall. You are passively watching a stream of perfectly produced high-definition images. There is a constant, unrelenting barrage of noise, music, dialogue, and bright, shifting colors filling the physical space of your home. If you get bored, you can press a plastic button and instantly summon any movie, documentary, or sporting event ever recorded in human history. Your entire living room is architecturally designed around this glowing rectangle. The couch, the chairs, and the coffee table are all precisely angled to face it. The screen is the absolute center of gravity in the modern American home. But what if you walked over to the wall, ripped that screen down, and shattered it? What if you took your smartphone and threw it into the street? What if you turned off the radio, disconnected the internet, and killed the electricity entirely? What would you actually do at 8 p.m. on a Tuesday night? For 99% of human history, that wasn't a hypothetical question. It was simply the terrifying, overwhelming reality of the night. Before the invention of the cathode ray tube and the broadcast antenna, the concept of passive, at-home visual entertainment did not exist. If you wanted to be entertained, you couldn't just sit there. You had to physically, actively generate the entertainment yourself, or you had to succumb to the heavy, crushing weight of the silence. This is the bizarre, deeply intimate, and largely forgotten history of what humanity actually did in the dark before the glowing screen rewired our homes, our habits, and our brains forever. To truly understand the pre-television evening, you have to understand the profound, almost physical presence of the dark in the 18th and early 19th centuries. Before the widespread adoption of cheap, safe artificial lighting, the night was a vast, unbroken abyss. High-quality beeswax or spermaceti candles were incredibly expensive luxury items, reserved only for the very wealthy. The average working-class family or frontier pioneer relied on tallow candles. These were crudely made from rendered cow or sheep fat. They burned with a dim, flickering, smoky yellow light, and they smelled horrific, like a burning slaughterhouse. You did not want to burn them unless you absolutely had to. Furthermore, the physical reality of daily life was utterly exhausting. Before the internal combustion engine and the washing machine, basic survival required staggering amounts of manual labor. By the time the sun went down, the average farmer or factory worker was simply too physically destroyed to desire entertainment. The evening was short, dark, and ended quickly in sleep. But for the growing middle class in the Victorian era, people who finally had a little bit of leisure time and the money to burn a decent candle, the evening presented a terrifying new problem: profound, suffocating boredom. If you were a middle-class family in 1850, sitting in your parlor, the formal predecessor to the modern living room, the silence of the house was absolute. There was no background music. There was no ambient noise. If nobody in the room was talking, the only sound was the ticking of a grandfather clock or the crackle of the fireplace. To fight off this crushing boredom, the Victorian family had to become their own entertainment network. The absolute centerpiece of the 19th century parlor was not a screen, it was the piano. Before recorded music existed, the only way to hear a song in your home was if someone in the room physically knew how to play it. The ability to play the piano was considered an absolutely mandatory social skill, especially for young women. A massive, incredibly lucrative industry existed solely to print and sell sheet music. When a new popular song was written in a place like Tin Pan Alley in New York, it didn't spread via radio or Spotify. It spread via thousands of printed sheets of paper shipped across the country. Families would gather around the piano after dinner, light the candles, and sing the popular songs of the day together. The family was the band, the audience, and the broadcast network all rolled into one. If you couldn't play an instrument and you couldn't sing, you sat in the silence. But singing could only occupy so much time. To fill the long, dark winter evenings, the Victorians invented a series of bizarre, highly structured, and occasionally terrifying parlor games. Without moving images to stare at, people craved visual spectacle and physical thrill, and they were willing to risk serious physical injury to get it. One of the most popular and most dangerous games of the 19th century was called Snapdragon or Flapdragon. It was typically played in the dead of winter, often on Christmas Eve. A family would gather around a large, shallow bowl placed in the center of a heavy wooden table. The bowl was filled with hundreds of raisins. Then the host would pour a massive amount of highly flammable, high-proof brandy over the fruit. The lights in the parlor were completely extinguished. The room was plunged into total darkness. Then someone would strike a match and set the bowl of alcohol on fire. The brandy would erupt in a massive, ghostly blue flame that cast eerie, flickering shadows across the faces of the family. The objective of the game was simple and completely unhinged. Participants had to plunge their bare hands directly into the burning bowl of alcohol, snatch a flaming raisin, and throw it into their mouths, shutting their lips quickly to extinguish the fire before it burned their throats. It was a game of pure adrenaline. The Victorian journals and diaries are filled with accounts of the chaos of Snapdragon, children screaming in delight and terror, the smell of singed hair and burning sugar filling the parlor, and participants suffering severe blistering burns on their fingers and mouths. It was incredibly dangerous, but it was visually mesmerizing. It was the IMAX 3D action movie of the 1850s. They were so desperate for the visual thrill of the flickering blue light that they were willing to literally eat fire in their own living rooms. But while the wealthy were playing with fire in their quiet parlors, the working-class citizens in the rapidly exploding industrial cities were experiencing a completely different kind of evening. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, cities like New York and Chicago were packed with desperately poor immigrants living in cramped, unventilated, and sweltering tenement buildings. In the summer, these tiny apartments became absolute ovens. Remaining inside the apartment after dinner was physically unbearable. Because they couldn't stay inside, the working class invented stoop culture. The entire social life of the neighborhood was dragged out of the private apartment and onto the front steps, the stoop, of the building. The street became the living room. People sat on the concrete stairs for hours every single night, talking, gossiping, playing cards, and watching the chaos of the city unfold. Children played stickball in the streets until it was too dark to see the ball. The evening was loud, intensely communal, and deeply public. But as the cities grew, a massive, insatiable demand emerged for cheap, loud, and visually overwhelming entertainment. The working class wanted a spectacle, and the free market responded with the explosion of vaudeville. Before television, if you wanted to see professional entertainment, you had to physically leave your house, pay a dime, and walk into a theater. Vaudeville was a chaotic, rapid-fire circuit of thousands of theaters across America that hosted bizarre, unconnected variety acts. In a single evening, sitting in a dark, packed, smoky theater, you might see a comedian, a trained bear, an acrobat, a magician, and a singer, all performing back-to-back in rapid succession. Vaudeville was the physical, live-action predecessor to the concept of channel surfing. It conditioned the American public to expect constant, shifting, visually stimulating entertainment. But it was still a deeply communal experience. You were sitting in a room with hundreds of strangers, laughing together, gasping together, and experiencing the spectacle as a massive, unified crowd. The bridge between the loud, public spectacle of vaudeville and the quiet, isolated glow of the television screen arrived in the 1920s with a magical, invisible technology, the radio. The invention of the commercial radio broadcast completely shattered the silence of the American home forever. For the first time in human history, you could hear the live voice of a human being who was hundreds of miles away, speaking directly into your private living room. The radios of the 1920s and 30s were not small plastic boxes. They were massive, beautiful, highly polished wooden consoles that stood on the floor like fine furniture. They became the new center of gravity in the home. The psychological shift was profound. Families no longer gathered around the piano to physically make music. They pulled their heavy wooden chairs into a semicircle and sat entirely in silence, staring blankly at a glowing piece of wood covered in fabric speaker mesh. Radio was known as the theater of the mind. Because there was no screen, the listener had to actively, mentally construct the visuals. When they listened to a terrifying episode of a mystery show like The Shadow or the slapstick comedy of Amos and Andy, their brains were working furiously to paint the scenery, imagine the faces, and visualize the action.
It was a massive leap toward passive entertainment, but it still required a deep, active level of human imagination. The radio also created the terrifying, unprecedented phenomenon of mass synchronization. Before radio, news traveled slowly and entertainment was localized. But suddenly, 30 million Americans were sitting in their living rooms listening to the exact same voice at the exact same millisecond. President Franklin D. Roosevelt weaponized this intimacy with his famous fireside chats. During the darkest days of the Great Depression, he bypassed the newspapers entirely. He spoke slowly, calmly, and directly into the microphone. Millions of Americans felt as though the President of the United States was sitting in their own parlor, drinking coffee and talking directly to them. It was a level of political intimacy that had never existed in human history. But this mass synchronization also proved how vulnerable the human mind was to the broadcast medium. On October 30th, 1938, a young director named Orson Welles broadcast a radio play based on H.G. Wells's The War of the Worlds.
The broadcast was formatted to sound exactly like a series of breaking news bulletins interrupting a regular music program. Welles described, with terrifying realism, massive metallic cylinders crashing into a farm in Grover's Mill, New Jersey. He described horrific Martian tripods emerging from the craters, incinerating the police and the military with invisible heat rays, and marching toward New York City. Because Americans had been conditioned to implicitly trust the authority of the breaking news radio bulletin, thousands of people absolutely panicked. They didn't check the newspaper. They didn't look outside. They believed the box in their living room over their own reality. People packed their cars, jammed the highways, and reportedly even wrapped their faces in wet towels to survive the fictional alien poison gas. The War of the Worlds broadcast proved something fundamental and terrifying. The broadcast medium was so powerful that it could overwrite reality. It could command the attention, the emotions, and the physical actions of millions of people simultaneously. Radio had primed the American public.
It had trained them to sit in a semicircle, to stare straight ahead, and to receive their entertainment from a box. It had killed the parlor piano. It had silenced the living room. But radio still lacked the ultimate, hypnotic prize, the moving image. The American public was ready to trade the theater of the mind for something that required absolutely no imagination at all. They were ready for the cathode ray tube. If you are finding this hidden history fascinating, hit subscribe. There is more lost history like this waiting to be uncovered every single week.
The physical invention of the electronic television is a miracle of early 20th century physics, driven largely by a farm boy from Idaho named Philo Farnsworth, who allegedly got the idea for scanning an image in horizontal lines by looking at the perfectly parallel plowed furrows of a potato field. But the early televisions were not the sleek, lightweight, flat-screen miracles we have today. They were massive, heavy, terrifying pieces of furniture. Early cathode ray tubes, CRTs, were essentially highly pressurized vacuum tubes made of thick, heavy lead glass. They required massive amounts of high-voltage electricity to fire a continuous stream of electrons at a phosphor-coated screen. The screens were tiny, sometimes only 5 or 7 inches across, and produced a grainy, flickering, highly distorted black and white image that glowed with a distinct, eerie blue light. Because the vacuum tubes were so massive and dangerous, the early television set was built into a heavy wooden cabinet that looked exactly like the radios it was designed to replace. When television broadcasting finally exploded across America in the post-WW2 boom of the 1950s, the adoption rate was staggering. In 1950, only 9% of American homes had a television. By 1959, nearly 90% of all homes had one. It was the fastest, most violent cultural and technological shift in human history.
And television didn't just change what people did in the evening. It literally, physically rewrote the architecture of the American home.
Before television and before the widespread adoption of air conditioning, the most important architectural feature of the American house was the front porch. The front porch was the bridge between the private family and the public community. In the evenings, families would sit on the porch to catch a breeze, talk to their neighbors walking down the sidewalk, and keep an eye on the children playing in the street. It fostered a deep, interconnected, and highly social neighborhood culture. Television annihilated the front porch.
Because you cannot watch television outside in the glare of the sun or the humidity, the family retreated indoors. The television required darkness to see the weak CRT screen, so the curtains were drawn. The architects of the 1950s and 60s began designing homes without front porches entirely. Instead, they designed homes with a family room or a windowless den located deep in the back of the house, specifically designed to eliminate screen glare. If families wanted to go outside, they went into the heavily fenced, isolated, and completely private backyard patio.
The public, social facing of the American home was completely abandoned. The neighborhood became a collection of isolated, glowing blue fortresses. Inside the home, the furniture was violently reoriented. For centuries, chairs and couches were arranged in a circle or a square, specifically designed to force the occupants to face each other and converse. With the arrival of the television, the furniture was rearranged into a rigid, theatrical seating arrangement. Every chair, every couch, and every recliner was turned to face a single point in the room, the glowing screen.
We stopped looking at each other, and we started looking at the box. This total, hypnotic capture of the family's attention led to one of the most depressing, bizarre, and widely adopted culinary inventions in human history, the TV dinner. In 1953, the Swanson Company found themselves with a massive, catastrophic surplus of Thanksgiving turkey. To get rid of it, they packaged the turkey with some peas and potatoes in a segmented aluminum tray, frozen it, and marketed it as the TV brand frozen dinner. The design of the aluminum tray was brilliant and insidious. It was shaped specifically to perfectly balance on the new TV tray tables that families were setting up in their living rooms. The TV dinner fundamentally altered the physical and social act of eating. For centuries, the family dinner was the primary social ritual of the day. It was a time for conversation, connection, and facing one another over a table. The TV dinner eliminated the dining room table entirely. Families now sat in rows in the dark, eating mechanically out of partitioned metal trays, staring straight ahead in absolute silence, completely hypnotized by the flickering blue light. The ritual of the evening meal was shattered. But while the television isolated families into their individual living rooms, it was simultaneously synchronizing the physical behavior of the human race on a scale that had never been seen before. The absolute, terrifying proof of this synchronization occurred not in the living room, but deep underground, in the municipal water systems of the major cities.
In the era of broadcast television, before DVRs, streaming, or pause buttons, you had to watch a show exactly when it aired. If millions of people were watching the exact same massively popular broadcast, like an episode of I Love Lucy, the Super Bowl, or the legendary finale of MASH, they were completely trapped on their couches. When the broadcast finally cut to a 3-minute commercial break, a bizarre and physically massive phenomenon occurred. Millions of Americans would simultaneously stand up, walk to the bathroom, and flush their toilets at the exact same millisecond.
Municipal water engineers across the country began noticing massive, terrifying spikes and catastrophic drops in the city's water pressure that perfectly correlated with the commercial breaks of the Super Bowl. This became colloquially known by engineers as the TV flush or the super flush. The sheer physical strain on the underground infrastructure of the Earth was staggering. Millions of gallons of water were suddenly and violently requested by millions of toilets, draining the massive municipal water towers by several feet in a matter of seconds.
When the commercial break ended, the flushing stopped entirely, and the water pressure would violently spike back up, sometimes blowing out old pipes and cracking water mains. The television had grown so powerful that it was no longer just controlling what people thought, it was literally controlling their bladders, and it was violently manipulating the physical hydrology of the Earth itself. But the synchronization of America wasn't just a matter of people choosing to watch the same show.
It required a massive, aggressive, and highly visible physical infrastructure that permanently altered the landscape of the continent. To push the television signal into the isolated rural corners of the country, engineers had to build massive, towering steel broadcast antennas. These skeletal metal towers, sometimes rising thousands of feet into the air and blinking with red aviation warning lights, were bolted onto the highest mountain peaks and the roofs of the tallest skyscrapers. They blasted invisible, high-frequency electromagnetic waves through the air, completely saturating the atmosphere with television signals. But this invisible energy terrified the early viewers. The cathode ray tube was fundamentally a particle accelerator. It worked by firing a high-voltage beam of electrons into a phosphor screen. In the early days of manufacturing, there was a genuine, scientifically founded fear that these massive glass tubes were leaking dangerous amounts of radiation and X-rays directly into the living room. This terror birthed the universal generational warning shouted by every mother in the 1950s and 60s, "Don't sit too close to the television, you'll ruin your eyes." It wasn't just about eye strain. It was a deeply ingrained paranoia that the glowing box was quietly poisoning the family with invisible rays. Some paranoid consumers even believed that the television was a two-way street, that if the signal could come into the house, the government or the broadcasters could somehow look back through the screen and watch the family in their private moments. Yet, despite the fear of radiation and the loss of the front porch, the hypnotic power of the glowing screen was absolute and unbreakable. The most profound proof of this hypnosis was the phenomenon of the test pattern. In the early decades of television, broadcasting was incredibly expensive. There was no such thing as a 24-hour news cycle or late-night programming. When the evening broadcast ended, usually around midnight, the station would simply sign off. The announcer would read a brief message, the national anthem would play, and the station would cut the live feed.
But the transmitter was still on. To give television repairmen a stable image to calibrate the geometry and focus of the CRT screens during the day, the stations broadcast a static, completely unmoving image known as a test pattern. The most famous of these was the RCA Indian head test pattern, a complex geometric grid. There was no movement, there was no dialogue, there was no plot. It was literally just a static picture of a grid and a loud, annoying beep. And yet, it is a recorded historical fact that thousands of Americans would pull their chairs up to the television set and stare at the unmoving test pattern for hours on end. The sheer, overwhelming novelty of the glowing blue light in the living room was so powerful, so fundamentally mind-altering, that people preferred to stare at a static, buzzing image rather than return to the crushing, overwhelming silence of the pre-television home. We traded the dark, quiet, localized reality of the 19th century for a massive, shared electronic hallucination. Tonight, when you sit on your couch and press that plastic button, take a moment to look around your living room. Look at how every piece of furniture is bowing to the screen. Look at the darkness outside your window. The screen in front of you is a miracle of modern physics. It brings the entire sum of human knowledge, art, and entertainment directly into your retinas. We no longer have to eat burning raisins in the dark to feel a thrill. We no longer have to listen to the silence. But that constant, unrelenting noise comes at a cost. The television killed the front porch. It silenced the piano. It atomized the neighborhood. We invited the glowing box into our homes to cure our boredom, and in return, the box demanded that we turn all the chairs around, sit in the dark, and never look away again. If this story changed how you look at the screen in your living room, subscribe to the channel. There are more hidden histories waiting to be uncovered. Click the video on screen to see what else humanity left behind.